I'm Nick Bateman, University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture Extension Entomologist. I'm housed over here at Stuttgart, and today we're going to talk about several things. You know, the first thing we've got to cover this year, right, is armyworms. You know, it's been an armyworm year. It's been the thing we've talked about the most, at least for the month of June and July. You know, we're at the beginning of August now, and it's seeing a little bit of a reprieve. You know, we got a lot of rice that's draining now that's not very susceptible to armyworms, but we've got a lot of rice still that's, green ring going into mid-season that we're expecting another flight to get into. And some things we can tell you about armyworms and at least defoliation in rice. We've looked at a lot of defoliation work over the past several years, and behind me we've got an April, May, and June planting. So this is the third year we've done this. You know, we had a graduate student work on defoliation for several years, and we picked up that work to refine it. And what we can tell you is, April planted rice can take a lot of defoliation. We don't even suggest making an application in April planted rice until you get over 40% defoliation. Once we get to 20% after green ring, that's where we're going to be at. And, May and June looks very similar. Now, I will say that they're a little more susceptible. You can also get into some pretty major heading delays if defoliation gets over 40% prior to green ring or 20% after for May and June planted. And a lot of that's just the way that rice is accumulating degree days. It's trying to move much quicker. And what we see with April is, it seems like it's a little slower accumulation there in that time period, and it seems to recover a little bit better. So typically what we see with armyworms in rice is our standard product would be Lambda Cyhalothrin. So that would be Warrior 2, Kendo, Lambda Cy, a lot of generics out there. But normally we can go out with a mid rate of it and do very well. So we started getting reports back late May from our counterparts in Mississippi, Louisiana, and even parts of South Arkansas, that guys weren't happy with what they were seeing with Lambda. And so we did some studies there, and depending on where you're at in the state, I've got trials that are showing 40% control with Lambda all the way up to 95%. And so armyworms, they're kind of interesting the way they can hybridize between the two different strains out there. And it's not uncommon to see these kind of things, but we're not used to it. And so what happened with all the misses we were having with Lambda, we pursued a Section 18 for Intrepid. So that's methoxyphenicide. And we were granted it at least under a crisis exemption through the state right now. And now it's still at review, the specific exemption still under review with EPA. But as of right now, we're legal to spray Intrepid in the state, and it's working very well for us. If we're going to be able to predict whether armyworms are going to be a major issue in the upcoming years, that's pretty hard to predict. It's not common for us to overwinter armyworms, raise our own armyworms in the state. They typically migrate up from South America, Puerto Rico, those areas, Argentina. And then once they get to the U.S., they're usually in Texas and Louisiana, and that's where we get them from. And this year, if you look at the weather patterns, we've talked about this with bollworms and soybeans the past several years, but if you look at those weather patterns and where all of this rain and where all the systems were coming from, it was all coming out of the south. And we think that helped those armyworms get here much, much quicker this year. But regardless, we saw the issues this year. We were able to get the 18, and if we need to, we'll submit it in the future. It's hard to predict whether or not that's going to be a major issue in the future. So moving on, like armyworms this year, we talked about it's probably been the major pest this year, but our typical pest we deal with, at least in paddy rice, being rice water weevil and grape colaspis. Right here on this station at Stuttgart, I'm officed here, but I'll be honest with you, I've got to travel to go find rice water weevil pressure. It's usually extremely light. So to put a number to it, usually our untreateds here are running 7 or 8 per core. A core is a 4-inch by 4-inch core. I go somewhere like Pine Tree and I'm running 30 on a low year. Well, this year I thought it was going to be the same thing. Very little adult pressure, very little scarring out there. We pull our core samples, we're running 50s and 60s. And so, running 50 and 60 here at Stuttgart tells me that we had some extremely high weevil pressure. And the other deal is, the lack of scarring we saw in a lot of these fields. The scarring is an indicator adults are out there, but it doesn't really tell you what kind of pressure you're going to have. Don't get me wrong, if I see a ton of scarring out there, I know I've got a lot of adults present, probably going to have a lot of larvae. but a light amount of scarring doesn't necessarily mean I'm not gonna have a lot of grubs in the ground feeding and causing yield loss. Y'all have heard us harp on seed treatments now you probably heard Gus for the past 15 years and me for the past 4, and there's a reason for that. You know, over the past 15 years, I can tell you with insecticide seed treatments, whether it be just a Neonic, Cruiser, or Nipsit, or going with a Dermacor Fortenza, the 2 diamides, we see an increase in yield. And the one thing we've been looking at the past several years is a combination of either that Cruiser or Nipsit in conjunction with Fortenza or Dermacor. And the reason we do that is because about 60–65% of our acres in Arkansas is this White River ground, this really white ground that's really loose and light. Especially when you talk about rice ground. And so if we plant rice in that, it's super susceptible to grape colaspis. Well, with Fortenza and Dermacor, you're not getting a lot of activity there. With Dermacor, you virtually get none, and Fortenza is better than Dermacor, but not by a whole lot for grape colaspis control. Whereas your Cruiser and Nipsit look awesome on grape colaspis. It does a really, really good job for us, but what we see there is after about 28–35 days, that Cruiser and Nipsit runs out of gas. And what we've seen over the past several years is if you plant in April, you're going to be going to flood, it seems like 50 to 70 days after planting. So we're 50 to 70 days after planting and rice water weevils are attracted to the flood, and that's when it's going to take us to get to flood. We don't have product left there to control those rice water weevils. Whereas products like Dermacor and Fortenza last much, much longer. You know, we've seen activity out to 80 days or so whenever it comes to armyworm stem borers with Dermacor and Fortenza. When you combine one of those Neonics and one of those diamides, what you see is you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting your grape colaspis control, and you also have a product with a lot of residual there that'll carry on and get rice water weevil for us as well. And so while we're talking about combinations of insecticide seed treatments, we got to bring up row rice and bill bug. And I'll be honest with you, we've tried, you pretty much name it, we've tried it. We've thrown the whole kitchen sink at bill bugs, and we've yet to find anything that'll truly zero them out, whether it be a foliar or seed treatments. But what I can tell you, over the past 4 years, every time we put our combine in the field, you know, those combinations always look better. And in some instances, like where our plots are at up around Newport, you know, that's some extremely high bill bug pressure. You know, it's pretty common for our untreateds and our Cruisers and Nipsits to be running 50% dead tillers up there. And whenever you get into a Fortenza and Dermacor plot where you've added that onto your Cruiser or Nipsit, what you're seeing is that's being reduced by about 60 to 70%. And it shows up in the combine. You know, we're consistently seeing 25 to 35 bushel increase there. Now that's extremely high pressure. A lot of guys are asking, you know, what do I do if I haven't seen bill bug in the past or extremely low levels of it? And so we had some plots last year up around Harrisburg, and it was June planted. You know, we were outside, or we never got bill bug pressure in it. And so we were, you know, thinking we probably wouldn't see the yield increase, but we still saw it. Now it wasn't as great, you know, it was only 4 or 5 bushels above the Cruiser and Nipsit by itself when you look at that combination. But, you know, I put all this data together over the past 10 years, and what I can tell you is if you go with a single product, whether it be Cruiser, Nipsit, Dermacor by itself, you know, you're looking on average at about a 7 to 10% yield increase depending on pressure. And so that's across 305 trials over the past 10 years. Now, if you look at adding that combination, so you go from 7 to 10% over an untreated, now you're adding about another 5 or 6, 7% there when you look at a combination. And so, you know, 85% of the time we break even, 95% of the time we're making money. And so it's very easy for me to go out and recommend going with a combination. I know a lot of folks don't want to put the extra money in up front, but it's something where I think we can save some money on stuff that hasn't been proven to work and put money towards these seed treatments that we've got 15 years of experience with and know that work. And so the last thing I want to talk about is rice stink bug. And you know, rice stink bug was kind of quiet earlier this year. At least we weren't getting the phone calls because all the armyworm phone calls. But I can tell you, we're the first week of August right now, and I can tell you I'm getting a lot of phone calls. And it's a mixed bag. It's anywhere between I'm running way under threshold to I've been at threshold every time I come back for the past 3.5 weeks. And so it's kind of a mixed bag out there right now. But you know, some of the issues we're starting to see is is some folks aren't too happy with what they're seeing out of Lambda. You know, I mentioned Lambda was our standard for armyworms. It's also the standard for rice stink bugs. And we're starting to see that in our plots too. And so we need to talk about what a control failure is and how to address that. You know, I've gotten a lot of calls this year where guys are in there 2 days after application trying to see what kind of control they got. Look, I tell you, in our plots, we don't rate them until 3 or 4 days after application. We need to give the product a little time to work. And with something like rice stink bugs, an indicator that you're having issue is nymphs, you know, within 7 days, big nymphs behind, you know, within 7 days of that application. And we're starting to see some of that right now. And so your only other option right now that's currently labeled is Tenchu, so that's Dinotefuran. And we're in fairly short supply this year on it. It looks great. It's more expensive than Lambda. It looks good though. But folks are really struggling to find it. You know, the company had issues with supply, just like almost every company did this year on products, and it's just like everything else we're talking about now. You know, supply has been extremely difficult. So, you know, we're seeing those issues with Lambda out there, and we are looking at options going forward. You know, there's some products on the horizon that they're trying to get labeled. The companies are trying to get labeled now, having, you know, between COVID and everything else, it's been held up at EPA. Hopefully going into next year, we'll have some more options there other than just our pyrethroids and Tenchu. So I want to say thanks to the Rice Promotion Board. You know, they fund, if not 100%, at least 50% of a lot of this work we've talked about today. I also want to thank the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture and the folks here at the station, as well as the other research stations we work at, for all of their help. And appreciate you tuning in today. Thank you.